Who had grandparents fight in World War II and what stories did they share? Grandfather was in an amphibious division in the Pacific Theater. He left us with little snippets of his time. A camp was pitch black because they didn't want to be visible from above. A guy in his cabin went to the outhouse and sat down to do his business when he heard something. He pulled his lighter out and lit it. A python was dangling down staring him in the face. He and another man were walking on a beach and the other guy just got shot through the head from a sniper. That sniper's decision led to my existence. General MacArthur showed up and gave him a promotion along with a few others. They took a video of MacArthur shaking the hands of a line of soldiers and used it for a pro-American propaganda film to be played before movies in the US. My grandma saw it and freaked TF out and the theater owners gave her a copy of the photo. My grandpa was in the army. He never spoke about his service but he was shot in the ankle and captured. He spent years in a VA hospital once he returned to the States. I heard second-hand stories about the POW camp. Specifically how the guards would smoke cigarettes and then intentionally flick the butts just out of reach of the prisoners inside the fence. He and his buddies devised a tool to reach out through the fence and grab the butts when the guard turned their back. They'd then pass the butt between them to get a tiny puff. He was a very kind, very quiet, very intelligent man who had a very bad drinking problem. Edited. Thanks for all the responses and awards. I think grandpa saw some because he never talked about it. And we later found out that he was lying when he said he never saw action. It's really sad how that generation suffered in silence. Men were taught not to show weakness. And it always makes me sad that soldiers didn't receive the help they needed to cope. My grandfather was a trained medic, not frontline but where they took immediate survivors. The Germans were known to sabotage train bridges and it was standard protocol to stop and inspect them before crossing. Well, his conductor was drunk and not only didn't stop but was speeding into the bridge when it exploded. My aunt has the pictures but let's just say the rubble he was found under. Wooden trains don't just derail, they shatter. Especially off a bridge, was crazy. He described it to me and I wanted to cry. He lost many friends. My grandfather was in the resistance in Holland. He never spoke about the war to his wife, children or grandchildren. If asked to relate stories he'd reply, "I will not be responsible for the nightmares of another." Would turn his hearing aid off and nap in his chair. None at all. My grandpa went to Europe as a teenager and it must have been messed up because he never talked about his experience all the way up to his death. He came back with 3 medals and nobody in the family knows what he did to get them. Both my grandfathers served in the US Army Air Force. One was a waist gunner on a B-17. He caught some shrapnel from a German AA gun one mission and almost bled out on the return trip. While he was in the hospital his plane was shot down. The other was an MP who would tell us about busting heads in bars. My grandpa on my dad's side was 17 at the time and lied about his age to get into the Navy. He played saxophone in the Navy band aboard ships in the Pacific. I don't think he ever saw action, though. Aside from that 6-sax action of course. My paternal grandfather landed on Omaha on D-Day. That's it. That's all he ever shared. We know he spent the duration of the war in Europe. But whatever he saw or did was too much to ever tell my grandmother, dad, aunt or uncle. My granddad was in World War II in a tank destroyer unit. He never talked about it but when I got back from a trip to Paris in high school he asked if it was still all blowed up over there. And said the last time he was there it was a big old mess. Grandfather trained in Canada with British officers before flying to Britain and to Italy. Was almost killed when his jeep drove off a cliff to avoid capture by Nazis. Was taken back to Britain to heal. Looked up the family of an officer he knew. Officer's sister became my grandmother. Grandfather was a US sniper in the Pacific. One of the best stories was of a cocky officer who showed up and lined all the infantry up on the beach to tell them there were a bunch of pansies and he was going to whip them into shape. These men had been seeing hand-to-hand combat for months. The officer finally said, "If there's a man on this beach that thinks he can whip my ass, Take one step forward. Every man took a step forward immediately. The officer didn't say much after that. My Austrian grandfather was drafted into the Wehrmacht and his unit was integrated into the SS in 1944. He was wounded in January 45 in the Battle of the Bulge whilst carrying out an attack on a US position. He got patched up by the Americans whilst the German officer wrote a letter home that he was missing in action. He still has the original letter. He was a prisoner of war in France from then on and had to stay until 46 or 47 as he was captured as a member of the SS and they were held longer than regular Wehrmacht soldiers. He still holds a grudge against the Nazis for stealing his youth and still has some shell or bullet fragments in his chest as far as I know. In short, my grandpa was made prisoner, was sent to Germany for work, volunteered to work in a farm. He knew nothing about farming but though food would be easier to come by. He didn't know German either. Became friends with a little girl there that was a bit older than his own kids. She started viewing him like an older brother. He attended her wedding once the war was over. She had a baby boy. He had a third and planned child too. Those became friends. Attended each other's weddings. Then they had kids. Me and one of the German kids decided to learn each other's language. Then we studied in each other's country for a year, thanks Erasmus program. I attended her wedding last year. We don't talk much anymore. I'm sorry to report. Not that good at keeping in touch from afar. But rest assured we're trying. My grandfather's friend has a story about a guy who said he was deaf so that he wouldn't go to the war. The guy choosing the people tossed a coin in the floor beside him and he immediately searched for it. He was sent to the war. My grandfather lied about his age and joined the Marines. Went to Iwo Jima and got his thumb shot off. Came home and rode shotgun for Wells Fargo armored trucks. When my grandmother died, we helped my grandfather move out of his house into an apartment. I had found a mason jar filled with old shiny rocks in his basement. When we looked closer, we realized it was gold teeth, AK kills from the war. That's when I learned my grandfather was a sniper. He served on the Pacific side fighting the Japanese. He died a couple of years ago at the age of 99. Well into his 90s though. He could still shoot a squirrel with a gun and a slingshot from a pretty long distance. He met up with the men in his unit every year after the war. Until they all died. My grandpa was in the Navy and was a rear gunner on a plane. He was still training when the war was finishing up, but the story goes that he was trying to shoot a target on the ground for training. He was adamant on hitting it so he unbuckled himself to get a better shot. Because of this he got pulled out of the plane and was hanging on only by the rear gun. Eventually he was able to pull himself back into the plane surprisingly. He probably never tried that again. My grandfather fled his home in Austria as a 12-year-old because he was Jewish. He and his parents were sent to the Viennese ghetto where he convinced two Nazis to let them flee under the cover of night. They eventually made it to Genoa where they caught the second to last ship leaving the port there. He lost his sister to the chamber unfortunately. But he and his parents fled to Japanese-occupied Shanghai, China where they lived in the slums for around 8 years. He worked as a snake catcher, black market trader, and eventually as a foot messenger for the US Army consulate there. He was also either the sole survivor or one of very few survivors of a US lead bombing at a radio station there. My grandfather enlisted when he was 14. Served in India for some years. But got shot by a sniper and was shipped back to UK. There was a bombing and a friend of my grandfather was hiding under the table but it collapsed on him, leaving him with a brain injury that would give him flashbacks from time to time where he again thought bombers are coming. To not get hit again he always started to run out of the building he was in. Once he jumped out of the second floor of a building because of it and that was it for him. My grandfather was in World War II and then was called up for Korea. He told my mom that he was in special forces and that his primary weapon was the garrote. He refused to tell her any stories. And he committed suicide. Both grandfathers. Both survived. Both only ever spoke about it to anyone on at most 2 occasions each. The only thing either of them ever said to me, as part of a larger family collective, about it was that the only thing you need to know about the war is that the people who didn't leave their corpse in the field left their soul instead. Those were the prices for coming home. Not my true grandparents but my grandma's oldest brother. He fought in the Pacific through hell and back. He went by Pearl Harbor the day after and the Arizona was still on fire. One island he landed on had so much opposition that he had to use the guys in front of him bodies as meat shields. One funny story was that everyone at the base knew he didn't drink or smoke since his father was a raging alcoholic. So his bunkmates hid their booze under his bunk whenever the officers would come by and inspect camp. I unfortunately never met him, but hearing about his stories really fueled my interest in stories from throughout modern wars. From World War I to Iraq. Edit. Damn, this blew up overnight. Not grandparents but great-grandfather. He joined Tito's partisans in 1942 and fought mainly in eastern Croatia, northern and western Bosnia and Herzegovina. He got very sick in early 1943 and almost died due to dysentery. What influenced him the most, however, was the hunger and the cold they had to endure. This led to him always stockpiling on food and firewood and always needing to be sure that everyone also stockpiled on food and firewood as much as possible. Both granddads in the Navy. Great-aunt survived a concentration camp. No one says anything. Ever. World War II was like Fight Club. Apparently. Well, my father and uncles all fought in World War II. I had 2 aunts who were also in the service. A grandfather fought in World War I. I grew up on the stories and his stories were the most upsetting. The way the command just threw everyone's lives away with the suicidal charges from the trenches. 67 years later. Those stories still haunt me. One uncle was in North Africa. Papa. One uncle and 2 uncles-in-law served in the Pacific. One uncle, the youngest, was on Omaha Beach and helped liberate a small concentration camp near what would become East Germany. His stories are the ones I remember best. The stench that hit the American convoy about a mile from the gates. The walking skeletons. The half-decomposed bodies and the dogs eating them. Unlike movies, war is not pretty and rarely does it have any happy endings. My uncle was tasked with pulling bodies out of the ocean after D-Day. He was supposed to be in the invasion but his officer reassigned him due to his age. He then became personal details for Eisenhower due to more people looking out for him. My grandfather served in the 101st Airborne Division. Field artillery. Kind of like Band of Brothers. There were a few parallels in the storyline. But he did it with a howitzer. He was dropped into France at night. His only story was about hiding in hedgerows. And knowing what cigarette the German soldiers had by the smoke smell as they walked by. It took his unit over a week to find that gun. Later he was dropped into Bastogne. Battle of the Bulge. He would later attend an annual dinner to commemorate the nuts to you reply the American general gave to German orders to surrender. He got his chance to tour Eagle's Nest. A couple weeks after it was taken by the Allied forces. Before shipping off for home. He was proud of his service. And very proud to be part of the 101st. But as stories to his grandchildren go, they were rare. The hedgerow tale was one of a lot of things I'd rather not remember. Part of the honor guard at his funeral saw the 2 jump stars on his airborne wings and in awe. Almost no one these days has one. My grandma was in the Merchant Marines and stationed on Lake Michigan. She was in charge of a Navy shipping yard. She said the hardest part was getting the men to look up from her chest. Then she got a master's degree in occupational therapy and worked for the Veterans Affairs. My one grandfather refused to ever talk about the war with anyone. Both of mine actually served in World War II but I never heard any stories. I am half German. My grandfather was in war. I never had the chance to talk with him about World War II. Because he didn't like to speak about it and later also got ill, so I hadn't any chance. Only thing I know from my uncle is that he was a sniper. He went to war I think in 1945 when he was 18 years old. when it was already clear that Nazi Germany will lose this war. He was somewhere in East Europe and got caught like many others by the Russians. So he was a war captivity. He managed to escape by jumping off a driving truck where he and many other captives were sitting on. And the Russians didn't notice, or noticed when it was already too late. He was then a few days on the run. He slept in the forest. Till he got back to Germany to the house of his grandmother where he hided till the war was over, because he was deserter. Normally he had to go back to war. I hope you could understand it. Had an uncle who was crew on a bomber in Europe who got shot down over Germany and spent the rest of the war as a POW. He never talked a whole lot about his experiences as only him and one other from his crew survived. My grandfather was drafted into World War I. He was from a ranching family in Wyoming and very skilled with horses. But he didn't want to end up in the mule artillery. He lied to the army and told them he worked in a dry goods store. So they made him a supply clerk. He was eventually put on a ship to France and arrived just as the war ended. He said all the soldiers went AWOL and partied for several days. I suspect it was an eye-opening experience for a country boy. My maternal grandfather, Canada, RXC, was about to get on the boat for the Dieppe raid and got pulled off at the last minute and put into intelligence. The guy that replaced him didn't make it. He spent a bunch of the war doing photo analysis and helped with the man that never was. Also, there's a famous story where Jen Patton, US, was to be told to wait for Jen Montgomery, UK, before entering Germany. Apparently, Gramps was the poor young officer who got to tell him. Great-grandfather was basically a carpenter or builder, a tech or something like that, and was constantly blinking hard to THR point of it being noticeable. I was told it was from the flares they used. He never shared stories. Would flat out refuse to talk to us about it. The only thing he would tell us is how much he hated those Ein Japs. That was the only time I heard THR man swear. I always just figured he was really racist, and at times he was. Montel Williams ed him off something fierce, but relatively recently I learned about the Pacific Theater and I can't really blame those men for feeling the way they did. My grandfather went to France 4-5 months after D-Day. Eventually moved into southern Germany. They went ahead to take out snipers. Only 3 things he ever said was a guy lit a cigarette at night and a sniper picked him off. The French girls were giving Americans kisses in the streets. He loved that. And he saw a concentration camp firsthand. Grandfather on my mom's side. He was in Europe somewhere guarding munitions that were stored in a rail car. He went into the munitions rail car and sat down to have a smoke. Gotta love the 40s. About 5 minutes later a German soldier hops into the rail car. Locks eyes with my grandpa and they both proceed to their pants and freeze. A few moments pass and my grandpa offers him a cigarette. They sit there smoking a while before the German motions to the door and my grandpa nods. German vacates the area and grandpa continues with his duties. Before my German grandparents met, they couldn't have had more different lives. My grandfather's family has some Jewish ancestors. So he didn't want to take any chances and fled to a farm in Switzerland until it was safe to return. My grandmother was part of the Bund Deutscher Modell, Hitler Jugend for females, and danced for Hitler when he came to visit our town. She was still a kid though, so I doubt she fully understood what was going on. They were in France and they hadn't eaten hot food in days. There was a hot apple pie on the window sill and they liberated it. On the way to the camp, they dropped it pie side down into a pile of fresh horse. My grandfather was a US Air Force navigator. There's a story of flying a Russian traitor and his mistress back to the USSR after they escaped to Italy. They were shot on the runway and Russian agents took his team out for a night on the town. My grandmother had a boy who was in love with her who was in the US military. We recently found a Nazi flag he brought back to her. The young soldier wrote on it "Home alive in 45. Best regards are." One of my favorite memories of my grandfather, who was literally like a Hallmark movie grandpa. is of him telling me about his time working in the mess hall. He proudly told me he could crack 8 eggs at once. And promptly got 8 eggs out of the fridge. Picked up 4 in each hand. Cracked them into a bowl. And threw away the empty shells. Then my grandma found out and made him take me to the store and immediately buy more eggs. My grandfather went ahead of the front line to deactivate bombs. Report sabotage or commit sabotage. Once he had the mission to bomb the large Nazi party in France to eliminate some officials all at once. While he was setting up some charges, he made contact with the drummer of the band playing the music for the party and signaled to him what was going to happen. The band then called 5 and avoided their deaths in the explosion. That drummer went on to start the Meanle Cymbal Company and thanked my grandfather profusely for what he did years later at the Frankfurt NAMM convention. Not my grandpa, it's a story involving World War II. After the war. But my dad. He was in the Air Force stationed in the Aleutian Islands in Alaska in the mid-60s. A lot of people don't know that Japan invaded these islands and they had planes and army trucks and more on the islands not long after Pearl Harbor. Anyway, while my dad was stationed there he went on hikes on his days off in the summer and found a lot of old heels and planes from that time. I love history and World War II is my favorite, so I always found this story of his and his descriptions of the old planes and equipment fascinating. My grandfather fought for the USSR during World War II. Subsequent to the Battle of Stalingrad, Russian troops were moving towards the west. There was one area where my grandfather's unit got stuck because the Germans had secured a bridge with heavy artillery. They waited for 3 days before one of his comrades yelled, "I hope they blow my dick off," before running into German turret fire. This led to a firefight that ultimately resulted in my grandfather and his unit taking back the bridge from the Germans. In the newspapers, they misreported him as saying "Long live Stalin" as his final words instead of "I hope they blow my dick off." My grandfather was a codder talker. So, my actual grandparents don't talk too much about it and didn't fight. But, where I lived we had English egg gunners over in the week of Memorial Day. They became granddads to me. The first time we hosted them I was like 6. And boy, they told us everything we wanted to know. We saw flight logs. Photos. If we asked they would tell. But mostly told me they didn't want to shoot the other planes but that they had to choose. It was shooting or getting shot. They told me about flights. Friends. How they thought everybody that died a useless dead. I don't remember all the stories they told, but the one above always pops up around Memorial Day. Especially this year and the coming years I believe. Since one of them have passed on Memorial Day this year. The other egg gunner we hosted passed a few years ago. My great grandma didn't fight since she was 14. She was Austrian and met an American soldier who helped her escape to Canada, saving her life and putting me, her great grandchild, in the States. My grandpa got brought over from Netherlands to Guernsey by the Germans. Was basically a prisoner and had to work for them. Went deaf quite young due to getting in a fight with the German officers and getting cracked round the head with some wood. He used to steal food from the German supplies and hand it out to the locals. Out the back of German lorries. He was building something for the Germans, which he found out later was a building they were planning to kill them all in. Thankfully the war ended. He wrote a book about it all. Destination Gustav. If anyone is interested. I'm 32 and only read it last year. Sadly he passed away 15ish years ago. My great grandpa was a Russian tank repairman. And one time he took a nap in a tank and woke up surrounded by Nazis. So he panicked. Started the tank and drove around the abandoned camp looking for his comrades. He accidentally destroyed a part of the camp and eventually found his group. But because he caused so much panic it gave the Russians enough time to launch a counterattack and take back the camp. The Russians were nearby watching this unfold. For his bravery he was awarded a bunch of medals. My nonna was a spy in northern Italy during the war. Once the Nazis took over Italy towards the end of the war, they used her family's house as their headquarters in her town. She would only be able to return home to get her clothes for the week and would have to sleep in another part of town with other young women who were secretaries. And she wasn't doing her clerical job. She would secretly transport grenades in her bike basket. She helped Jews escape into the mountains. Helped blow up a train track at night. And even got correspondence from General Patchen. I want to write a book about her. But she can only talk about the things she saw for short periods of time before she gets too emotionally drained. She's celebrating her 99th birthday in March 2021. She's a cool lady. She was a spy for the US Allies. Her father was American and her mother was Italian. She lived in Italy her entire life up to that point and spoke some English which she used to help her with her spy activities. She moved to the US after the war. Her spy name was Wanda.